Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kayla and this is where we talk all about project management in lean teams and startup organizations. On today's episode, we're going to discuss how to manage a project. I'm going to break this up into 4 phases and we'll learn about some key things that we need to make sure get done at each phase. I'll give you some questions that you can ask at each phase to make sure you're staying on track, and we'll talk about red flags to look out for at each phase. Now, the reason why I am making this video is because I have gotten requests from several of my lovely viewers who have said, "Hey Kayla, could you make a video on how to manage a project?" And at first I was reluctant to do this because I am acutely aware that there are many different kinds of projects. There are many different ways of managing projects and frameworks, and different companies manage projects in different ways, and different project managers have their own techniques. So I certainly didn't want to come across as like, this is the way you manage projects. My way is the right way. I don't want to come across as prescriptive, but rather simply giving you information about this is how I approach most of my projects. These are the things that I want to make sure come together in most of my projects, but not even all of them, because every project is different. So for you as a project manager, what I want to encourage you to do is to research, read, talk to other project managers, understand how they manage projects, get to know how they manage projects, get to know different frameworks and methods and things like that. Because with everything I talk about in this video, I'm really just going to gloss over it, but you could totally geek out on absolutely anything, any of the phases and any of the pieces of the phases and any of the questions that I am posing to you in this video. You could totally geek out on it. So if you haven't already started your project management education journey, please do so. But I hope this video is helpful to those of you who are like, I'm just looking for a simple guideline, like how would I manage a project practically? What are the steps that I need to take? I don't want to hear a bunch of jargon or business terminology. I just want to understand how to manage a project. That is what this video is. So I hope it is helpful to you. But first, I want to introduce myself. If we haven't met already, my name is Kayla McGuire, and I am passionate about project management in lean teams and startup organizations. I've spent a lot of time working in startup, and I've gathered a lot of tips and tricks and tools and wisdom and strategies that I want to share with you here on this channel. So if that is something that is interesting to you, I want to invite you to subscribe, and I want to ask you to let me know any questions that you have about this topic, because I want to know how I can help you. Okay, on to today's topic, where we are going to talk about how to manage a project. Now, as you may know, a project always starts with a phase called initiation. And initiation really means that we have been given permission to begin a project. And this is a really important thing to remember, is that you need that permission to begin a project. And permission can come in several different forms. It could come in the form of a document that's known as like a project charter. Sometimes larger organizations or enterprises have this document as a project charter, and it basically says, like, here's the project sponsor, the person who approves the project, and here's what the project is, and here you go, project manager, go ahead and get started on this project. As a project charter document. It could also come in the form of a statement of work, an SOW, where you have an agreement with a client or another party that you will be delivering a certain set of deliverables, right? So that could be another way the project is initiated. In either case, you need something, like you need something formal that tells you to move on, to go forward with the project. Don't ever start a project just because you think it's a good idea or because you got like verbal approval from someone. And this can happen in all kinds of organizations, but especially in startup, you need something formal. You need some formal approval there. So this is the first thing that you need to make sure of in your project. Now, if you are a project manager at a startup, there is a high likelihood that you may have been involved in the steps that lead up to initiation. Maybe you've helped with some of that preliminary research or some of the conversations with the client and sales. Like, you could have been part of that project before the initiation starts. But the initiation is that formal document that says, hey, here we go. So there's a few key questions that I will want to ask at project initiation. The first first one is, who is the project sponsor? Who is the person that called this project into existence? The second one is, who are the key stakeholders? Now, you may already know this from your previous involvement in the project or from the documentation that crosses your desk, but if you don't, it's a good question to ask. Who are the key stakeholders? I also want to know if there's any information about like budget or timeline. Where did that information come from? Sometimes I've been a part of projects where the budget numbers or the timeline are just totally made up. And so I like to have these conversations in initiation to really get an understanding of what's realistic, where did these numbers come from before I put a lot of time and energy and effort into planning. So you want to ask those questions. You'll also want to know, and this may seem obvious, but this is a very good question to ask, what are we doing and why? What is the value that we're offering and why are we doing that? Why does this even need to happen? You want to understand that before you move on into planning. And then the last one that I like to ask here, is there anything else that we need to provide as a deliverable that's not explicitly stated in my statement of work or in any other documentation that I've been given at this point? Is there anything else that we need to deliver? And you would be surprised how often that answer is yes, where they thought, oh, we just didn't think we needed to put it in there, or we forgot to put it in there. This is very important to understanding as you move forward into your project planning process. You need to ask that question. Now, some red flags that you'll want to look out for at initiation. We've already talked about a few of these, but if your scope is unclear, if you don't have any deliverables listed, if there's no budget or timeline listed, if you don't have stakeholders or sponsor listed, these are all going to be red flags for you as the project manager. You need to make sure to get this cleared up before you move into the planning phase. And the reason that you want to do that is so that you have really clear expectations and parameters around what it is that you are putting together. You're doing this as a favor to the project as a whole to ask these questions and really get this all ironed out before you move into planning. Which leads me to our next phase, which is the planning phase. And that's the phase that every project manager loves. We all live for planning, right? Because we love to make lists. I'm just kidding. There's a lot more to project management than making lists. But this is the part of the project when you really want to make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row. Okay, because this is when it is starting to get serious. So there are a few things that I always like to do in my planning phase. And again, depending on the size and the nature of the project, you may have a more or less robust project plan. But at a bare minimum, this is usually what I like to do. I like to have a kickoff call with my client or with my stakeholder. And on that call, I want to get to know my stakeholder. I want to know who my main points of contact are. I want to know how they like to communicate. I want to establish a meeting cadence with those stakeholders. And I want to make it clear that this is why we're meeting and this is why we're holding regular meetings. If we need to cancel one of these meetings because we don't need it, that's fine. But I always like to have placeholder meetings on the calendar, especially as the project goes on and people kind of get tired and they don't really want to meet. It's very important that we keep that communication open. So I always like to establish a meeting cadence. Another very important thing that you must do on your kickoff call with your client is ask them questions about what are they expecting. So what are your expectations around the project? What would be success to you? What would be like a good definition of done for you? And oftentimes what you'll find is it's a little different than what is in your initial scope. It's a little different. And so having these conversations up front and uncovering maybe some of the additional expectations that a stakeholder has, that doesn't mean that you're doing everything they ask, but it just means you're uncovering some of these ideas and things that they thought might be included in the project. It's very important that you have these conversations because otherwise you get 3/4 of the way through the project and then they're like, hey, where's ABC thing? And you're like, well, we never talked about that. And they'll say, well, we thought that was going to be included. So it's very important that you talk about, hey, what are your expectations? What would be success for you? The other thing that you'll want to do at this point is start to gather any requirements that you need from the client. I always like to have some sort of maybe a Google Drive folder where we can drop assets or other documentation from the client into. You'll want to get that all squared away on your kickoff call and start to gather any requirements that you need. You'll also want to reiterate what the budget is, what the timeline is, and talk to them about where there's flexibility with the timeline. And often what you'll find is there actually is quite a bit of flexibility. Even if there seems to be a firm deadline or firm dates, they will often be quite flexible with that timeline. So you'll want to have those discussions. I also like to have a project kickoff with my team. And on that kickoff, we talk a lot about the same things, like what are we doing and why are we doing this and what is the value that we're delivering. We talk about who will be working on the project, what's the definition of done, what are some of the risks and challenges that we foresee coming. And another really good question to ask your team at this point is, what do we feel really confident in? And where do we feel less confident, where we might need to allow ourselves some more time to figure out how to do XYZ thing. These are all conversations that I want to have with that team. Now you'll notice I haven't actually gotten into planning my project, like formally creating a work breakdown structure. That happens after I have those conversations, because those conversations really inform me as I am putting together my plan. So the next thing that you'll do is create your plan, create your work breakdown structure. So this is when you go into whatever system or tool that you have for this, whether it's like Monday or Asana or Shortcut, whatever tool you're using, this is when you'll go in and you will take your project and you'll start to break it down. You'll start with the big milestones and then you'll break it down into packages and then you'll break those down into tasks. And what you'll want to make sure of as you are breaking down your work into tasks, you want to make sure that your tasks are always measurable. So a good rule of thumb is if you can look at your task and say, oh, I know that that would take 2 hours or 3 hours or between 2 and 4 hours. Like you want to be able to estimate those tasks. If you can't, if you're like, ooh, I don't know, that could take a couple weeks. That task isn't broken down far enough. You don't understand it well enough. You need to research that a little bit more so you can create a more comprehensive and accurate plan. So that's what I'll do with my project plan. And then some red flags that you'll want to look out for in planning is if you have a really slow to respond stakeholder or a stakeholder who's completely unresponsive. You'll want to get that figured out before you move on, especially if you're going to be very reliant on this stakeholder for feedback and approval. You want to make sure that the communication is open and you're able to get a hold of that person. So I'll have a conversation with the stakeholder and say, hey, is there someone else we could work with as well? Another thing you'll want to look out for is unclear expectations. So if you get on that kickoff call with your client and there seems to be confusion about what they want, or maybe there's internal confusion about what the point of the project is, that's a big red flag. You'll want to have that all ironed out before you move forward with the project. And then a couple other red flags you'll notice as you get into planning and building your work breakdown structure are if you realize you don't have enough people to work on the project. Maybe you thought you only needed 5, but it looks like you actually need 10. That would be a red flag. Let's get that figured out before we move forward. Or perhaps you realize that it's going to cost more or the timeline needs to be extended. Again, let's work that out in planning when we recognize it in planning. Of course, we know this is a common thing, time, cost, quality, and project management. A lot of times something has to give. My advice to you is if you notice an issue in planning, let's get that figured out on the front end before we move into execution, because inevitably there's going to be more stuff that pops up in execution. So let's get everything figured out and ironed out as best we can before we move into the doing phase of the project. So that leads us to execution, which I am going to call the doing phase of the project, when we are building the things, creating the deliverables, getting the work done. This is execution. In the execution phase, some of the things that you'll be doing as the project manager are checking in with your team, supporting your team, helping them remove any blockers, communicating back and forth with your client, looking over deliverables. You'll be doing a lot of this sort of work in execution. Some questions that are helpful to ask as you're in execution. Did we encounter anything unexpected, and how are we going to deal with that? Another question you might want to ask is, do we have our priorities right? You might notice as you progress through the project, your priorities shift. So these are conversations and questions that you'll want to have with your team as you're working through the project. Some red flags to look out for in execution are assuming everything is okay, even though you're not hearing from anyone. You always want to make sure that you're checking in with people, that you're offering your help. Execution is not a time for the project manager to get lazy. It's not. And I know this is a common complaint with project managers, is that they just kind of sit there and look at their timelines. Execution is the time when you should really be supporting your team and helping achieve that goal. And a lot of that is with proper communication. So you always want to make sure that you're checking in, not only with your team, but with your client, making sure everything is staying on track and that you are helping out where you can. If people on your team are getting burnt out, you want to help with that as well. So it's very important that you stay in touch as a project manager. Another red flag would be if you have a lot of scope creep in it. Scope creep can sometimes be insidious. If you notice it kind of like slowly starting to sneak in through your client, you have to put a stop to that. You have to figure out where your boundaries are going to be with scope creep before you get into a lot of trouble with it. So beware of that. Now, our last phase is the closing phase. This is the quickest and easiest phase, right? Because we're literally just making sure that we have delivered everything that needs to be delivered. We're wrapping up everything that needs to be wrapped up, having our final communications with the client, getting final approval, getting final sign off. So not a lot in terms of red flags here. I guess you could have a red flag like if you don't have the deliverable or if the deliverable isn't the right thing. That would be sort of like a red flag, I suppose. But some questions that you will want to ask at closing, and I do find that closing often gets overlooked in project management, but closing is a really important part of project management to understand how we performed not only as project managers, but as a team, as a company. How did we perform and how could we do better? So some of the questions that we commonly ask in a retrospective is, what did we do well? What didn't we do well? What could we do better next time? What could we improve? Where did we add value or impact our client? Asking these questions and opening up conversation around it is very important to becoming better as a team. So don't forget to do that with your projects. So those were our 4 phases, some of the things that I do in each phase, some questions that I ask, and some of the red flags that you should look out for. I hope this was helpful to you. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time. Bye.